One morning, without the thunder of artillery or the smoke of burning cities, $300 billion simply stopped moving. Not stolen, not destroyed, just frozen. Numbers on screens across Europe and North America turned inert, as if time itself had been paused by unseen hands. Somewhere in Moscow, vaults were still full, balance sheets still printed, yet the money was suddenly untouchable. The war had crossed into a quieter realm, and almost no one heard the door close behind them. For decades, the modern world lived by a comforting myth. That money, especially state money, was sacred. That reserves held in dollars, euros, and Western bonds were neutral ground. Above politics, above punishment. A kind of financial Switzerland, immune to rage, ideology, and revenge. Nations planned wars, survived sanctions, and endured crises under one shared assumption. If everything else burned, the reserves would remain. Then the West broke the spell. With a few legal signatures and press conferences delivered in calm, bureaucratic tones, Russia's foreign reserves were rendered useless. No tanks crossed borders, no missiles flew. Yet the effect was seismic. A nuclear power discovered that its financial lifeline existed only by permission. Safety, it turned out, was conditional. This was not just an attack on Russia. It was a message, whispered but unmistakable, to every country watching. Your money is safe, they were told, as long as you remain on the right side of history. And if history changes its mind, so will the locks on the vault. In that moment, safe assets stopped being safe. They became weapons. To understand why that moment mattered, you have to step back into the ruins of the 20th century, when the world was exhausted by war and desperate for rules. After empires collapsed in fire, a new order was assembled, not with crowns or flags, but with currencies and promises. The dollar emerged as the axis. Gold stood behind it like a silent witness. Trust became the real currency, and the West became its custodian. For generations, central bankers were taught a simple doctrine. Politics was noisy and temporary. Finance was sober and permanent. Governments might fall, ideologies might rot, but reserves held in New York, London, or Frankfurt were supposed to be untouchable. This belief was not written into any constitution. It was stronger than law. It was custom, a gentleman's agreement among powers who understood that once money became a battlefield, everyone would lose. That illusion hardened over time. Bonds issued by Western states were labeled risk-free, not because risk vanished, but because power guaranteed stability. If you stored your wealth inside the system would protect you. Even enemies understood this rule, especially enemies. During the Cold War, hostility had limits. Financial annihilation was one of them, and so the world learned to separate war from wealth. Armies could clash, diplomats could lie, but reserves remained sacred. This was the quiet foundation of globalization, the reason trade expanded, and savings piled up in Western vaults. Safety was not a property of money itself. It was a promise, and like all promises, it only mattered until the day it was broken. Russia understood sanctions. It had lived with them, studied them, adapted to them. After earlier confrontations with the West, Moscow began to prepare the way empires always do when they sense future siege. It stockpiled foreign currency. It accumulated gold. It shifted reserves away from obvious pressure points, or so it believed. This was not recklessness. It was calculation. Year after year, oil and gas revenues flowed in. Instead of spending them, the state locked them away. Dollars, euros, sovereign bonds, quietly stacked in accounts far from Russian soil. The logic was brutally rational. In a crisis, these reserves would stabilize the ruble, fund imports, and signal endurance. They were meant to be armor, cold, heavy, reassuring. There was a deeper assumption beneath this strategy, rarely spoken aloud. Whatever else happened, the West would not cross that line. Freezing a central bank's reserves was considered a financial nuclear option. Too destabilizing, too dangerous. It would shatter trust, not just in an adversary, but in the system itself. Russia believed that rule would hold, because everyone needed it to. This was the fatal miscalculation. By placing its faith in Western custodianship, Moscow accepted the rules of a game designed by others. The reserves were real, but control over them was not. When the moment came, Russia discovered that preparation is useless if your shield is stored in the enemy's house, and the door, once closed, does not need to be forced. The freeze did not happen with drama. That was the most terrifying part. No emergency sirens, no secret midnight meetings leaked to the press, just coordinated statements, legal language, and the smooth choreography of institutions that had rehearsed this power for decades without ever using it. Central banks spoke of restrictions. Finance ministries spoke of measures. The word weapon was never uttered. Mechanically, it was simple. Russia's reserves were not stacks of cash sitting in a single vault. They were claims, accounts at foreign central banks, securities held in clearing systems, bonds registered in jurisdictions that answered to Washington, Brussels, and their allies. With one decision, access was denied, transactions blocked, assets immobilized. The money still existed, but only as a ghost. This was the true face of modern power, not conquest, but custody. The West did not seize the reserves. It did something far more precise. It reminded the world who ultimately controlled the pipes, the switches, the legal definitions of ownership itself. In an instant, sovereignty collided with infrastructure, and infrastructure won. What made this moment unprecedented was not legality, but scale. Never before had the reserves of a major central bank been neutralized so completely, so openly. The taboo was gone. What had once been unthinkable was now policy. And as the systems adjusted, as screens refreshed and balances froze, a silent lesson spread across the globe. In the financial world, power is not about who earns the money. It is about who can stop it from moving. At first there was silence. Not outrage, not applause, but calculation. Finance ministers read the headlines twice. Central bankers said nothing at all. In glass towers from Asia to the Middle East, people stared at balance sheets that suddenly felt heavier, more fragile. The freeze on Russia's reserves was framed as exceptional, moral, necessary. But everyone understood the subtext. Exceptions have a way of becoming precedents. Publicly, allies praised the decision as elegant and bloodless, a punishment without bombs. Privately, a colder emotion took hold. If this could happen to Russia, it could happen to anyone outside the inner circle of trust. The question was no longer ideological. It was positional. Where do we stand when the rules are rewritten in real time? Gold prices twitched. Quiet meetings multiplied. Old conversations about diversification resurfaced, no longer as academic exercises but as matters of survival. The fear was not that the West had acted. It was that it had proven it could act, and would, when interests demanded it. Nothing collapsed overnight. That is how the danger hides. The system continued to function. Trades cleared. Payments flowed. Yet something invisible cracked. Trust, once lost, does not shatter loudly. It leaks away. And across the world, institutions began to behave differently, not because they opposed the West, but because they had learned a lesson they could not unlearn. Safety was no longer universal. It was selective. The realization arrived not as a headline, but as a chill. A slow, collective understanding that settled in rooms where power usually feels permanent. Russia was not a fragile state. It was not isolated. It possessed energy, territory, weapons capable of ending civilizations. And yet, in the realm that mattered most to modern survival, it had been disarmed without resistance. This was the moment the illusion finally collapsed. Safe had never meant neutral. It had meant aligned. The reserves were protected not by law, but by belonging. The financial order revealed itself as a hierarchy, not a marketplace. At the top sat those who wrote the rules, below them, those who lived by permission. For decades, countries had mistaken access for ownership. They believed that because their names were on the accounts, the money was theirs in any meaningful sense. Now they saw the truth. Control does not reside with the holder. It resides with the gatekeeper. And the gatekeepers had chosen to demonstrate their reach. The shock was existential. If deterrence failed here, where else did it fail? Military power suddenly felt clumsy compared to legal authority. Missiles could destroy cities, but they could not unlock a frozen balance sheet. In that instant, a new form of vulnerability was exposed, one that no army could guard against. The climax was quiet, but irreversible. The world had crossed a line it could not step back over. From that day on, every reserve, every bond, every risk-free asset carried an unspoken question. Safe from whom? And for how long? The shift did not announce itself with rebellion or rupture. It arrived quietly, disguised as caution. Balance sheets were adjusted, reserve strategies were reviewed. Words like diversification and resilience appeared more often, spoken in neutral tones that hid unease rather than confidence. No one declared distrust in the system. They simply behaved as if trust could no longer be assumed. Central banks began to act like institutions that had seen a warning shot. Gold was treated less as tradition and more as refuge. Bilateral trade arrangements expanded, not because they were more efficient, but because they were harder to interrupt. Payment routes multiplied, redundant by design, like escape corridors built into a fortress after the first breach. This was not ideological defiance. Many of these countries shared no sympathy for Russia's actions. But sympathy was irrelevant. What mattered was precedent. If access could be revoked once, it could be revoked again. And in finance, survival depends not on morality, but on optionality. The old order did not collapse. It continued, outwardly stable, even dominant. But beneath it, behavior changed. Quietly, irreversibly. The world had learned to hedge not against markets, but against guardians. And in that silent recalibration, the foundations of financial power began to shift, not in anger, but in preparation. What followed was not rebellion, but adaptation. Quiet, deliberate, almost invisible. No speeches denouncing the system, no dramatic exits, just subtle changes in behavior that revealed a deeper understanding of what had happened. Power, the world realized, no longer needed to invade. It only needed to administer. This was conquest without occupation, influence without flags. The West had demonstrated a form of dominance far more efficient than force. By controlling settlement systems, reserve currencies, legal jurisdictions, it could discipline states without firing a shot. Violence was outsourced to spreadsheets. Compliance enforced by access. You could feel the shift in tone. Countries began speaking the language of resilience and autonomy, words that sounded technical but carried existential weight. Gold was no longer a relic. It was an escape hatch. Trade agreements quietly rewrote clauses about currencies. Payment systems multiplied like underground tunnels, not to overthrow the order, but to survive it. This was soft power stripped of romance, no ideals, no universal values, just leverage. The brilliance and the danger lay in its invisibility. Ordinary citizens barely noticed. Markets adjusted. Life went on. But beneath the surface, the rules of survival had changed. To exist outside Western approval was no longer just risky. It was structurally punished. And so the world learned a new grammar of empire. Not built on colonies, but on custody. Not enforced by soldiers, but by clerks and compliance officers. History had not ended. It had simply learned to whisper. The true catastrophe was not measured in lost billions, but in something far more fragile. Belief. Once broken, it does not return in the same form. The world did not abandon the system overnight, but it stopped believing in its neutrality, and that was enough to change everything. From that point on, every reserve carried a shadow. Every risk-free bond came with an asterisk. Safety was no longer a universal property. It was a political status. To be secure meant to be trusted. To be trusted meant to be aligned. And alignment, history reminds us, is never permanent. This was the inheritance left behind by the Freeze, a global order where money had a passport and assets carried ideology. The old promise of globalization, that economics could tame politics, was quietly reversed. Politics had reclaimed economics, and it did so without apology. The most dangerous part was the precedent. Once a taboo is broken, restraint becomes a choice, not a rule. Future crises would not need new inventions, only new justifications. What was once extraordinary could now be argued as responsible. The line had moved, and everyone could see it. This was not the collapse of the system. It was something more subtle, more corrosive, the beginning of doubt. And in finance, doubt spreads faster than panic. Long after the headlines faded, the memory remained. Not of what happened to Russia, but of what could happen to anyone, under the right conditions. Every era leaves behind a warning, usually written in the language of its own power. Ours was written in balance sheets and frozen accounts. The lesson was brutal in its simplicity. There is no such thing as a safe asset, only assets protected by someone stronger than you. And strength, in the modern world, is measured less by armies than by control over systems you cannot opt out of. History once taught empires to seize land. Then it taught them to seize trade. Now it has taught them to seize trust. The freeze of Russia's reserves will be remembered not as an episode of punishment, but as a revelation. A moment when the mask slipped and the machinery beneath was briefly exposed. You are told this was necessary, that it was moral. Perhaps it was, but history does not judge power by intentions. It judges by consequences. And the consequence was a world that can no longer pretend money is neutral, or that safety is permanent. The unsettling question lingers long after the shock fades. If wealth can be immobilized with a signature, if sovereignty can be paused by infrastructure, then where does security truly live? Not in vaults, not in currencies, but in relationships of power that can turn without warning. This is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a more anxious chapter, one where every nation, every institution, and eventually every individual must ask the same quiet question. When the rules change, whose permission do you need to survive?